Dr. Amy Meyers, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's wonderful to be here, having listened to your program for many years.
Oh, my heart is filled with joy to hear that. Well, we're going to be talking about you're another podcaster, and it's always great to talk to a podcaster. You're a podcaster, you're a blogger, you are many things, and we're going to focus in on those many things, and we'll get to the podcasting, etc., in a bit. But I want to start off kind of with your background. So I hear a bit of New York in your voice, I think. Where did you grow up?
Well, I'm proud of that in my voice. Thank you, because I actually grew up in Long Island. But as I've said recently, I feel like I grew up in New York because I've been here since after college. So about 30 years. Do I get to call myself a New Yorker yet?
I would think so. I would think, and to me, Long Island is pretty much synonymous with New York, and that's my ignorance, I guess, that I sort of lump it together.
They're a little distinct because there are pockets, many, many, many pockets of Long Island that are not quite diverse like New York City.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what kind of family did you grow up in? What was your family like?
What was my family like? My family was dysfunctional.
Wonderful.
I'm in the right place, right?
Yeah, right.
I have a brother, and we are the only children of two parents, one who is still with us, one who is not. And again, we grew up for the first many years in Riverdale, which is in the Bronx. And I've been told that I'm not allowed to say I'm from the Bronx because it was a middle-class suburb of the Bronx and doesn't really reflect, the persona of the Bronx. And we moved to Long Island when I was 12. And as I just mentioned, worked my way back into the city after college. So my parents were working parents. My mother was a therapist. She got her master's. Yeah, if I remember, she got her master's when I was, I want to say like 10 years old, and then worked in outpatient clinics and eventually private practice in our home. And my father was a radiologist.
Okay, so did the fact that your mother was a therapist, did that make you want to become a therapist, or did you initially reject that, and did it take many years to come back around?
I never rejected it, and one would think that it would come from the modeling of my mother, but I think it's more got to do with the dysfunction and really being curious about interpersonal dynamics and the way that people relate to each other and why and where and how that develops.
Yeah. Would you be willing to talk a bit about the dysfunction?
It's really interesting because I didn't know if you were going to ask about this. And just yesterday, I was interviewed on my podcast by somebody that I wanted to have on as a guest who is a social worker. And it turns out her background is a documentarian. And she said to me that, I think your audience would find it interesting to know about your career trajectory and just your life and who you are.
Yeah.
And I thought about it before we actually did the recording. And I said, okay, I think I'm going to use this as my first opportunity to come out. And by come out, as I put in quotes, is my own history of sibling abuse. I have a series on my podcast dedicated to that topic, and I did my dissertation on that topic. And have kind of developed an expertise in the area, but I never really took public ownership of that.
Okay, and well, I saw that in your bio, and that sort of led me to want to pursue that a bit more. So go ahead.
Yeah. So I mean, I've never really told my full story. I'm not quite sure I'm ready to do that, but this is the beginning of just letting folks know that it is reparative. It can be repaired, that therapists are people with their own issues who have also generally struggled probably, in our lifetime and has developed our interest in allowing or providing that compassion for other people. And so part of that is, my history. But I think I was hesitant for so long because I'm beyond midlife at this point. And so why did I wait so long? Probably due to one, there still being some sense of shame around it in some way.
Hmm.
And not that
Yeah.
I feel I did something to elicit it and that kind of shame, but just I don't want that to be my identity.
Right.
I don't want to wear that as my identity. I want people to see
Yeah.
me for me and who I am now, which is a totally different person than, when this was occurring.
I wonder if I can push you to be just a little bit more explicit, because sibling abuse, I'm not sure what that means. That's such a general term.
Oh, well, as I've explained on my podcast, one of the most important thing to do is to distinguish it from sibling rivalry. So I don't know if that's what you mean when, what do you mean by sibling abuse? For me, I was physically and emotionally abused. Of course, there's sexual abuse as well. But it's
Okay. Yeah.
basically, I mean, if I were going to summarize it really quickly, it's this really similar to parent-child abuse, only it occurs between and amongst siblings,
Yeah. Yeah.
simply said.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate your being willing to go there and give me a little background on that, because I saw in your bio that it's been an important area for you, that you are working in and working out, working
Yes.
on, working out.
Yes. Yes.
Um, where did you? So, at what point did you know that you wanted to become a therapist?
I have a feeling it was in college. I can't really kind of put my finger on it, but in my school, they didn't have a social work program. I majored in sociology because, again, I knew I was interested in people, and I also was drawn towards an area that I was doing well in. And I think we tend to excel in things that come naturally
Yeah.
to us as
Yeah,
well.
definitely. Yeah.
Right. So I
Yeah.
majored in sociology, and
Where
I
where
think
was that? What school
that
was
was at
that?
Ithaca College, upstate New York.
Okay.
And I then pursued a master's in social work thereafter, where I knew I had a terrible memory regarding my own trajectory, but I knew I
Me
wanted to be a
too.
social worker, but I think I also wanted to be a therapist, and I knew it would take more than 2 years of graduate school, but that was my start. Let me see if this is really where I want to go, and it was confirmed. And so I didn't think that after 2 years of graduate school that really prepared me to be a therapist. So I shortly thereafter embarked on a 10-year journey in a psychoanalytic institute.
Yeah. And so that and you got your master's in social work and a PhD at Hunter. And I'm familiar with the name Hunter, but where's that located?
That's in New York City. It's a CUNY school, the
It's in
City
the city.
University of New York. Yeah.
Okay.
It was on 79th Street, and it's now made its way up to oh my God, sorry, 118th Street. But
Okay.
I don't know if that has much meaning to our listeners, your listeners. But it was so actually the 10 years of psychoanalytic training was in between the master's and the PhD.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I assume that a lot of the psychoanalytic training was both training because you wanted to get deeper, be able to do deeper work, and also do deeper work with yourself and understand yourself and your childhood and make sense of it.
Yeah, I think that began as soon as I started my master's degree, because to this day, I say this all the time. I believe that BSW and MSW students, and part of the curriculum should be a mandate for your own therapy. But I knew that not only did I have to work something out, and I needed to work on my stuff, but that also to be a good therapist, I had to have the experience of being on the other side of the couch. So, being in an institute, they actually require, what was it, 3 times a week for 4 years.
Wow, that's
So I did
very
some heavy
intensive.
lifting.
Yeah, I'll say heavy lifting is
Yeah.
right. Wow. And I might have wanted to become a social worker had I known that was an option. But at the time that I was in school a long time ago, there was no master's level degree that you could get that I knew about. Actually, if I had known, if anybody had ever mentioned, well, there's something called social work or psychiatric social work, I would have gone for it because that would have sounded like the easier route than becoming a going to medical school to become a psychiatrist or even. And the funny thing is, I spent so long in graduate school I could have become a psychiatrist or a doctor or something like that. But hey, the chips fell the way they needed to fall. I'm
But it's
pretty
also a
sure.
very different focus,
Yeah.
right? I mean, medical school and going into psychiatry is really focusing on, the chemical composition of the mind
I
and
wouldn't
how
have
to
known that at the time.
at the time we're so okay. I thought we were
Yeah, I
talking
would
about
not have
that.
known
Okay.
that. I
Right,
was
right.
pretty naive,
Uh-huh.
but I had a kind of a general sense, like you, that I wanted to work with people, that I was interested in people, that people tended to confide in high school, in high school
Right.
and college. People tended to confide their problems in me, and I liked that part of it. And I ended up majoring in creative writing, and I felt there was some connection between the novels that I was reading and drawn to, because they got into the substance of people's lives,
Mm,
and that was what I thought being a therapist might be.
mm. And you were correct.
It looks like it, as it turned out. Um, and So we should mention that you've had really diverse clinical experience. I mean, you don't look that old, but and maybe you're not that old, but my God, you've had a lot of experience. Take us through some of that.
Define old.
Yeah,
Right.
really. Yeah,
What's old? It's all relative, right? When I was younger,
yeah,
I thought 30 years old was old.
yeah.
So take you through some of that experience. Oh boy. So, I mean, I've worked in an inpatient psychiatric hospital on a male admissions ward. I've worked in outpatient therapy for many years before I started my private practice, which really was a diverse experience, even within that setting, right? Diversity of age, diversity of socioeconomic status, diversity of diagnoses. I remember my first job out of graduate school was working with substance abusing mothers. And I have to say, I had no interest at the time in working with that population, but I knew I needed to get my feet wet. And that was the job that called to me or was available at the time. And I think that no matter what I've done, you learn from, and that's the beauty of
Yeah.
this work, is that, there's a lot of skills that are generally, applicable to any population that you work with. I've worked in program development. I've worked with the post-incarcerated population. But I have to say I don't regret a single experience, but my most rewarding experiences is working with folks like me and you of the neurotic population, and helping piece together the parts of our lives and understanding our past and how that influences our present. I'm really, and the focus of my podcast is really on countertransference, right? So it's fascinating to me to continuously look at us as practitioners as we're understanding our clients as well.
Yeah, yeah. And the podcast is interesting. It's called I know what it's
What
called.
would Dr. Meyers do?
What would Dr. Meyers do?
Yeah.
Which is and tell us about what you had in mind. When you decided to do that, what were you thinking of?
Well, I didn't gestate over the idea for a long time. I'll have to tell you what happened. It was very organic. I was teaching my class on generalist practice and helping the students prepare for entering their field practicums. And one student, and we had some really lively discussions and, always these kind of anticipatory scenarios. And one student said to me, "Oh, I wish I had you in my back pocket that I could always kind of pull out and be like, what would Dr. Meyers do?" And
Nice.
somehow I was thinking, well, how can we make this more public? And I don't love academic writing, even though that's a requirement to be part of academia. I'm a much more kind of natural from my head writer.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, I could do this through blog work, but also podcasts are very trendy now, and it's a way to get your voice out to, a large population. And so I thought it could be very helpful to beginners, but also we cover topics that seasoned practitioners can relate to. And importantly, I wanted anyone not even in the field to be able to relate to it. So if you're someone who's curious about yourself, curious about other people, I think that it allows you to really kind of look inward. There's something that's going to speak to anyone and everyone in every episode. So I was taken back to, I also teach human behavior across the lifespan. And I always see students start to drift off in that class. And I always joke that it can't be because of me, right? They're not drifting off because they're bored. But I see what's happening is that they're starting to think about themselves and their own families.
Yeah, right.
Dynamics. And I thought, well, why not allow everybody who's interested in that, and can just sit in their car or exercise or listen wherever they want and have that internal self-reflective process.
So what's the structure of your podcast? As you know, I have guests, and that's the structure of mine. Do you have guests, or how do you come up with the topics?
First of all, I'm rearing our 26th episode, so I'm very new to the game. But thus far, yes, I've had guests, mostly who have been my students or alum. I'm moving into now seasoned professionals, and we talk about anything from cases and, again, looking at countertransference to talking about a particular topic, whether it's self-disclosure, engagement, boundaries, whatever it might be, their own personal life histories, and how they have to really consider how they approach their work and not let this stuff interfere or use their self without necessarily self-disclosing, right, to benefit the client. But it's always thinking about, where are we in this? And I've also now recorded several episodes that is just me talking, whether it's about confrontation or sibling abuse, and wanting to, again, just have it resonate with folks.
Yeah. Well, I've looked at your I haven't really listened to the podcast, which I can't believe I didn't. I can't believe I didn't, in preparing it. I did. I don't think I listened. I may have listened to this. My memory is not good at this point in life. But I do remember looking at blog topics, and I was struck by how substantial they were. And
Thank you.
And now that I've heard you talk a bit about the podcast, I see that there's a lot of substantial content there as well, and it's really about, okay, what's it like to be a therapist, and what goes on in the therapist's mind, and what are the big issues.
Exactly.
And so that all makes more sense to me now than the title of the show initially did. The title of the show left me uncertain.
Ooh, that's not what good. You were up to. Well, that's fair. That's not good for me. And maybe at some point I'll look at that. But that's very curious. It's funny because I felt that the title was a little grandiose. And I was very anxious about, who's Dr. Myers?
Yes, right.
And who cares what she would do?
Yeah, I can understand
but
that.
I thought that,
well.
if my students felt that was appropriate, and that they kind of saw me as somebody who could offer some wisdom and help and direction, then eventually I could capture an audience that would, feel the same way.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't have a better alternative title that comes to mind. I mean, it's probably perfect for what you actually are doing. So which came first, the podcast or the blog, or?
The podcast came first,
okay.
Actually. And then I thought I, wanted to kind of riff on some of the topics that we had been talking about. And sometimes the blog has nothing to do with a particular episode. It's just a thought of the day, that I thought could be helpful to some folks and relatable. That's really what I want, relatable.
Yeah. I want to ask you a little bit about your current work. You have you're a professor and director of field education at Molloy University on Long Island. I must confess, right. I had heard of Long Island, but not Molloy. Mm-hmm. What sort of school is that?
So it's an undergraduate university. It's small. It's Dominican. It is it's located in Nassau County. It's got a major reputation for its nursing program. But I have to say, our social work department has put out some amazing social workers, and a lot of the community is interested in having our students intern for them and subsequently hire them. And we have some competition in the area. So we were a college. We actually very recently turned into a university, even though that we had the qualifications for a university for quite some time, but we just really had never made the application. So I think we're going to become more known, across the United States. I think you're not alone in not really having heard of it outside of the tri-state area.
You said Dominican, and I'm wondering to what extent is it Roman Catholic? Not
I don't
at all.
know. No, is it Roman Catholic? I mean, I think it has some roots in Catholicism, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's not like it's a religious school through and through. It's more in the sense of, we have 4 pillars: community, service, to name a few. And it, has certain undercurrents of values of the Dominican sisters and the Dominican tradition. And, it's not like we have prayer in classes or anything like that. And I'm Jewish, by the way. So, I'm very comfortable teaching there.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the thing that got me wondering was I went to the site to try to find out more about it. And it mentioned spirituality as being one of the key things.
That was one of the pillars I didn't mention. Yes.
Being one of the pillars. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I wonder, what sort of spirituality do they have in mind? I'm all for spirituality, but again, that can cover a wide range of things.
That's the wonder of it. And I think that demonstrates an openness, right? And a welcoming to any religion and any form of spirituality.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds good to me. Actually, I was in a similar situation of my academic career was at Sonoma State College.
Mm-hmm.
And then later that became Sonoma State University. And so there was a similar transition there. And it happened, I think it kind of happened throughout the system, that there was a state college system and a state university system, and the UC system,
right?
Very confusing. University of California, Berkeley, and so on, high prestige academic places, and then the ones that were more sort of practically oriented. And so I was drawn to Sonoma State. And I'm also I'm realizing that there's a school in Marin County called Dominican. And lots of people go to Dominican, and some of the people I know have done part-time teaching at Dominican. So it's probably a very similar situation. They probably know each other somehow.
Perhaps.
Well, I guess I would like to dig into something that you want to dig into. It might be one of your blog topics, or something else that's top of mind for you for the time that we have together.
Oh, that's such a generous question. I wish I would have given that some thought. I mean, so many topics interest me regarding therapy and the therapeutic world and different populations. But of course, I'm gonna toss that one back to you, because I can talk endlessly about countertransference and or sibling abuse, or both, right? So how do I get in there?
Talk about countertransference.
Okay, I'll talk about countertransference. So, one thing I don't know, even though I've listened to many of your episodes, is your audience. And I assume most of your audience is in the field, but I'm always kind of sensitized to those who listen to any podcast, therapy podcast, and are not in the field. And so I'm going to break it down a little bit.
Yeah, that's fine. And I would say, in terms of my audience, my impression is, it's very varied. And, but so I think a lot of them are professionals, and then I think quite a few are either in therapy or planning to be in therapy or wondering about therapy. So it's relevant.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So first I have to, before we talk about countertransference, I have to start with transference, and the two are very closely aligned. Transference is basically projections that clients make onto the therapist, and
Right.
countertransference is the projections that therapists make onto the client. And some of these are in our awareness, and much of it is not in our awareness, right? It's unconscious. So basically, how I like to describe it
So
is
that's a key point I want to
yeah.
underscore. Unconscious, because it's easy to miss that and to kind of go into feelings of blame, let's say, blaming the therapist for something that they've done, and they don't like me.
Right.
Will frequently come up, right?
Right.
They don't like me. They're rejecting me. Blah blah
Right.
blah. You pick up the ball from there.
Okay. So, yes, how I like to describe it is that basically we have had numerous and multiple experiences when we were younger with people and in certain situations that we take in, we internalize, we make our own, we believe those experiences and those words that have spoken to us, or the messaging that has been given to us, either very positive, right? You're wonderful, you're great, you're so smart, you're attractive, whatever it may be, or very critical, you're no good, you're this or you're that, or you can't do this. We take that in, right? Because we're being molded at young ages, and we are in the midst of our identity development, and we are reliant on other people to give us feedback about who we are and how we move through this world. So after we internalize it, we externalize it. We then move through this world expecting other people to relate to us as these figures did in our earlier life. And so that's where the projection lies, in the sense that, David, if I were meeting you for the first time and you even just looked at me a certain way, and I was sensitized to being criticized, I would think that your look, I might interpret it as being judgmental, right, or critical. Or or also not knowing you if you were my professor and I walked into your classroom and I have an issue with authority because authoritative figures in my life, whether they were mentors, teachers, or caregivers, treated me a certain way, I would already be primed to receive you in a certain way when I entered that situation, right? And a lot of my students will talk about walking through the hallways, and this friend didn't acknowledge them on this day. So they start to think about, what did I do? When in fact, that other person might be having a bad day or in their own zone, that they didn't really see you. And so that's why these are projections. And we assume that other people are going to relate to us in this similar fashion. We do this millions of times a day. And most of us aren't aware of the fact that what we are doing is projecting. It's not the real situation. And I always say we never really know what somebody else is thinking or feeling unless we ask them. So we come to all these conclusions on our own. And I think that it's really, really important as therapists, right? This is where the countertransference comes in, because again, we're human beings too. We've had these earlier life experiences as well, and even not just earlier, in our everyday, as we continue to grow and relate in the world, and we continue to make assumptions about people and how they're going to relate to us. And we now have established our inner sense of self. Is it kind? Is it nice? Is it harsh? Is it mean? And so when something happens between a client and a therapist, I think it's incumbent upon the therapist to be really self-aware and self-reflective, to know, like the example you were giving earlier, that client could come in and say to you, I forget exactly what you said, but made me feel a certain way, or, right? It's like, am I making them feel this way? I need to be able to look at that and say, is it me? And do I need to consider how I'm relating to you? Or is this giving me information about the client and how they move through this world, right? Thinking about how other people are feeling and thinking about them.
Yeah, what you're saying reminds me that there are different flavors of psychoanalysis. And I'm wondering what flavor your school was.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because I thought you were going to ask what is my flavor currently, and I don't even know anymore. If you like,
Right.
so it was very Freudian. It was very psychoanalytic. It was Kleinian, but it was also Stolero, and it was also relational and ego psychology and self psychology, and so I mean, there was a lot of emphasis, obviously, on working with the unconscious, and I think I have somehow taken and adapted and adopted many of those theorists. But it's almost as though, many, many moons later, I can't tell you which angle I exactly work from. It's just become a part of me. And I also think that as I've developed in my practice, as well as developed as a human being, as well as working with a different generation at this point in life, that I have to become much more eclectic. And I can't just approach every client with a psychoanalytic framework, right? It depends on who you're working with and what they're bringing to you and what they can tolerate. How many of our clients now can lay down on a couch with a therapist sitting behind them and, tap into their unconscious? Now we've moved in such to the other extreme that clients want interaction, they want advice, they want, to feel heard and understood, and kind of see us as people who have a certain level of wisdom. And I always say, though, on the one hand, the way that I would lead my life is not necessarily the way that other people or my clients need to or do lead their lives. So we need to kind of come to a place where we can explore and find out what would work best for you.
Yeah, I like how open you are to the complexities of the reality in which we all swim these days. And it's very complex even in terms of the dynamics of transference and countertransference. There's so many kind of levels of that. It can kind of drive yourself crazy trying to go around in that. And then, as you point out, the people, the expectations that people have for therapists and what the therapist can be or do for them are also so varied. And there are populations that are so far away from any kind of therapy, and are these people to be cast into outer darkness, as it were? And the answer is no. We have to find compassion, to work with these people as well.
That's why I think that, it's so important to, again, be eclectic. I've utilized a lot more CBT now, right? Because people need some concrete coping skills. And we know that psychodynamic and psychoanalytic therapy takes a very long time. I always say, if it took you, 40, 50 years to develop into who you are, we're not going to undo that overnight. So how does somebody cope in the meantime? They need some concrete ways of working. And then that's also where I think my social work background comes in, handy, because, just even providing resources, right? Or being a liaison to the community. People say I only want to do micro work, right? I want to focus on the individual or do therapy, but you can't really do micro without the macro, and you can't do macro without the micro.
Okay. Well, let's move on to that other topic.
Okay.
Which sibling relationships.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Let's move on to that. Where do we start with that? First of all, sibling relationships are the longest relationship you'll ever have in your lifetime, which is kind of really, astonishing, really, to kind of hear that, because I don't know how many people really think about that. Unless, of course, you emotionally cut them off. But otherwise, it's, from birth till death, they're there.
They'll probably live longer than your parents in a lot of situations, mostly, right?
Yes.
So, and that's how they get to be the longest relationships.
Yes. And they're very impactful. They shape our idea of loyalty, friendship, communication, our ability to negotiate, and our framework about competition. And I mean, there's so much, and love, and sharing, and mutuality, and so much, right?
And trust.
And trust, of course.
Yeah,
Sorry. How
yeah.
could I leave that out? Right? That's the
Yeah,
relic almost
yeah,
for all of these other things. Yes.
right, yeah,
And so it's amazing to me how in our work, I don't know if you've experienced this as well, we don't tend to give enough attention to the impact on our development of the sibling relationship. And I know that like those who work in outpatient mental health clinics, certainly, that's not part of the intake, right? Or the biopsychosocial that's performed to try and understand some of the family history and dynamics that are leading up to or contributing to the current situation being presented. And I think that we have to, get there fast
yeah,
because to me, it's obvious. And maybe it's obvious to me because of the situation that I had, right? That when it's not a healthy relationship, it can be really scarring. And all of those dimensions that I mentioned are impacted.
yeah. And some of the populations that we see today come from ethnicities that are much more heavily weighted towards a family and sibling relationships and so on. And we might.
Can you say more? What does that mean?
Well, I'm thinking of people who are from Asia, people who are from Mexico or South America, and so on, and sibling relationships and sibling love and so on can be a major dynamic in their lives.
Major. I understand what you're saying, in regard to also the expectations within a family, right? Of being caregivers, of depending on each other, and a whole host of other aspects of the relationship. But I don't know if that's so. That's interesting. Okay, something to ponder further, for sure.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in America, we generally don't have respect for our family members in the way that they do that they do in other countries. And I mean, if you look at the treatment of parents, right, where in other countries parents are revered and elders are revered, and you would never put them in a nursing home as they got older. You're going to take care of them throughout their lifetime. And we just don't have that level of, for lack of a better word at this moment, respect in our culture. I think in our American culture. Yeah.
Yeah. And the sort of historical core value in our culture has been independence and being an independent person.
Mm-hmm.
And one hopes to get free from their family to some degree. And then later you're confronted with, well, you can't necessarily do that. And you have to find your boundaries and your place where you're going to be. I think we live in a crazy mixed up culture.
I'm thinking that more and more myself. Yes. It's very challenging, to say the least. Yes.
Yeah.
And that I think we have a lot to learn, things we can learn from other cultures.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm running out of fuel here. You can take us wherever you want to, or we can begin to wrap things up.
I would just say, let's see, if you want to learn more about sibling abuse and the impact that it has on development and the long-term implications for having had that experience, and certainly in the way that you had stated in regard to trust and all these other aspects that are required for intimate relatedness, then please do listen to that series on my podcast. Again, it's called What Would Dr. Meyers Do? And if you are just generally interested in learning more about you, I think you'll find something to take, something to ponder as well. And I think for everyone, I guess I would want to send this message if I could, if we're going to wrap up, which would be somebody in my class just yesterday said, I think said this about herself. I feel like I'm almost too self-aware. And that just took me back to a time in my life around her age when I felt the same way, and probably for many years thereafter, where I often said, wow, there's something to this idea that ignorance is bliss. And I think that it has to do with when you are self-aware, and you don't like yourself very much, or you're uncovering things that are, unpleasant, then yeah, self-awareness is not something you want to embrace. But I think that the more work you do on yourself, or the older you get, or maybe both of those things in combination, self-awareness gives you a leg up in so many ways in this world, and particularly in the realm of relatedness and connection to other people. When you understand who you are and where certain thoughts and feelings and behavior comes from, then aren't you armed with the ability to use that to your advantage to build connection in a really positive way? Aren't you armed with the ability to really like yourself and see that you're complex people, that we are all complex, and that while we have our limitations, of course, we also have strengths that we're just not attuned to enough. And I could say so much more about that, but I think it was just kind of like a moment that where I stopped and said, wow, I am so far from that feeling. Thank God, because it's a really uncomfortable place to be in, where you think that self-awareness is kind of a curse.
And you spoke about liking yourself, and I was thinking about self-acceptance as being an important place to arrive to in your life, maybe after a lot of ups and downs and judgments, etc., self-condemnation and condemnation from others and setbacks and so on. But to come to a place where the bottom line is some appreciation for the value of your life, and I would think that's one of the fruits of a good psychoanalysis, or a good therapy, or just a good life.
Well, I was going to say a lot of therapy. And I think through that process, you improve your life. When you say a good life, I mean, I don't know how many of us are born with a good life and how we would define a good life. And, a lot of people think about where you grew up and what you started with, right? And obviously it has nothing to do with how my life kind of turned out. There are things that we have control over and things we don't have control over. I think it's a matter of accepting that and accepting the limitations of other people so that we're not chronically disappointed. I think we have to mourn some losses, and not even through death, but, for the people in our lives, caregivers included, siblings included, of not being able to be who we needed them to be perhaps at the time, but who probably did the best they could.
Yeah.
And I think that that's freeing, once you kind of accept that and mourn that, and, understand that people are limited and it's okay. There's no perfect person, and there's certainly no perfect parent, and it's the hardest job in the world. And we're all just people trying to make our way.
Right.
And that's all I got to say for now.
Okay. Well, I know that you could say a lot more, and that you do say a lot more on your blog and on your podcast interviews. So I want to encourage people to indeed go find them. And your podcast is on Spotify, so they can probably find you somehow by searching Spotify, I would guess.
It's on
right?
Spotify, Apple, Amazon, Stitcher. I don't know. We just increased our platform, so it's all over the place.
Yeah,
very accessible.
Great. Okay, great. And also, you have I was trying to figure out where to send people, and you have a website that I do. Think could be kind of the mothership, maybe, of
you want me to promote that?
AmyMeyersPhD.org.
That is correct. And you can follow me on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook at Dr. Meyers Pod.
All right. Well, Dr. Meyers, I want to thank you for being my guest today on Shrink Wrap Radio. And
I thank you. I thank you so much for allowing me this platform and this opportunity. And as I said, I've listened to your show for quite some time, so it's a double pleasure to be with you. And I look forward to anything further down the road.